Within Shattered Legacies, there are a multitude of different races. We're very well aware of the major ones, these being the Ciritans, humans, Yvetan, Barramon, Bastilians, and Florians. However, there is a whole host of minor races that, for the most part, make up the entirety of the Ciritan Empire. Now, when we're talking about other primary factions, such as the humans and the rest, they don't really use other races. Humans oftentimes believe themselves to be superior to all other Xenos, and as a result, their empire is almost completely made up of humans. That being said, they do have minor races in there, but they're more so closer to slaves rather than anything else. The Barramon are far too angry at each other, to let alone any other form of life, to have any sort of subservient race that isn't directly Barramon or one of their creatures that follows them. Bastilians believe in their prowess being far more important than that of other races, and the Yvetans could quite honestly give a shit less. If it can't cast spells, it's not really much of an interest to them. Finally, there are the Florians, which, whilst I wouldn't say that they find organic life abhorrent, they certainly don't care about it. That being said, the Ciritan Empire does quite like its minor races. We're going to be covering quite a few of them today. The first one on the list is one we've already talked about, and this was back during the Mightiest Warriors within the Ciritan Empire episode. This specifically being the Cobalt. Now, Cobalts have a rather interesting position within the Ciritan Empire, and that is that they are the only race that, at birth, are given Ciritan citizenship. Normally, to obtain Ciritan citizenship, you have to serve the Ciritan Empire for X amount of time. I believe I used the United Colonies from Starfield as an example. You have to serve in the military or serve in some other branch of the Ciritan Empire before you are given the privilege of being a Ciritan citizen. That being said, becoming a citizen brings a lot of different bonuses, such as free healthcare, the best that is in all of reality, given the technological prowess of the Ciritan Empire, insane discounts on any good that you can imagine, which is already insane of itself, considering the absolute broken economy that the Ciritan Empire has. If you don't remember that, you can look up the Ciritan Empire episode proper, where we talked about its economy, as well as a whole multitude of other boons. That being said, just because you're not a citizen of the Ciritan Empire doesn't mean that you aren't a member of it. If you aren't a citizen, you're considered a worker. Now, of course, we're getting a little bit off track. What is a Cobalt? Well, a Cobalt is a very small creature, usually standing at around maybe 3.5 to 4 feet tall. They possess scales all across their body and a pair of horns coming out of their head, as well as a muzzle coming out of their face. You should know what a Cobalt is. If you've ever looked up any fantasy, you know what a Cobalt is. That being said, Cobalts aren't designed for combat. Cobalts, whilst they do have scales on their hide is relatively thin. Not only this, but they have bones similar to avians in that their bones are hollow and very lightweight. As a result, it's very easy to do incredibly debilitating amounts of damage to a Cobalt with very little effort. That being said, that's not the purpose of Cobalts. As I said before, Cobalts are by far, other than the Ciritans proper, are one of the most respected races. And this is due to the fact that, whilst they lack combat prowess, they do have incredible minds. In fact, the majority of Cobalts exist either within the mercantile guilds or the Ciritan military as generals and strategists. Now, we're going to start with the military, as this is considered to be the minority. Cobalts can go anywhere from captains of vessels to even admirals. Admirals oftentimes being individuals who are in charge of patrols, such as fleets that are roughly between 20 and 30 vessels. Either that or planetary defense forces. Nothing particularly large. They're capable of chasing away something like maybe pirates or something, but any major threat, an admiral alone isn't going to last very long. Beyond that, you have the Fleet Admiral. Now, Fleet Admirals oftentimes have ships well over 200. And oftentimes this is, think the defense fleet around something like a Ciritan glitter world, or maybe even a very, very financially unstable core world. You know, these are the vessels that can bring in some serious pain. They can take out entire pirate fleets and armadas on their own. Beyond that is another rank known as the Fleet Admiral. Did I already go over that? That's what I just explained. What was the original? It doesn't matter. Regardless, though, typically a Cobalt will only obtain the prestigious rank of a Fleet Admiral. This being, like I said, a individual who controls several hundreds of vessels. Now, technically, there is a rank beyond this known as the Armada Commander. Now, it should be noted that Armada Commanders are not a higher rank than the four Ciritan Commanders. The four Ciritan Commanders head one of each of the four branches of the Ciritan military, this being the infantry, the navy, Ciritan special forces, these being things such as their super soldiers and such, as well as the fourth one being other, which oftentimes is whatever that commander needs to be doing, some random odd task. Not only this, but oftentimes things such as armor and atmospheric aircrafts are delegated to the fourth. Now, of course, that seems a little off topic, but remember that we're talking about a fleet commander. Now, fleet commanders are really big head honchos, and Cobalts have never held the rank of a fleet commander. Fleet commanders oftentimes hold thousands, multiple thousands, maybe even upwards of 10,000 vessels under their command. This is oftentimes some of the most important core worlds or even splinter branches of the Holy Armada. Now, of course, there's also other things that Cobalts can do within the military. A lot of them hold positions as strategists, giving various different detailed plans and strategies to Ciritan military officers in order to give them just that little bit of an extra edge. Yeah, a Ciritan could do the job, but you're going to get just that little bit sharper of an analysis, just that little bit better of a plan when it's created by a Cobalt. Now, of course, when we're talking about Cobalts in general, it's only about maybe 5 to 10% of their entire population that exists within the military. Cobalts themselves having a very low population due to their genetics. The majority of their race is oftentimes found within the mercantile guilds. Now, we'll go over the mercantile guilds proper in its own deep dive, as there's actually a lot of information about them, but suffice to say, you can think of it like this. You have a collection of planets, and that is a solar system. After that, you have a collection of solar systems, and this is known as a subsector. And then a collection of subsectors is simply known as a sector, and then it goes into even higher and higher levels until you get to galactic, and then universal, and then multiversal, so on and so forth. Mercantile guilds will oftentimes control a cluster of probably subsectors. Some of them, if they're particularly wealthy, may even hold clusters of sectors in themselves. And you can kind of think of mercantile guilds similar to countries in the real world. There are relations. Mercantile vessels aren't weaponized. In fact, if they need escorts, they get escorts from the Ciritan military, and as a result, they have no direct control over these military vessels. Some mercantile guilds have incredible relationships. They consider themselves allies. Others, if they had guns in their ships, would be at total war with one another. But again, that deserves its own deep dive. Next up on this is known as the Beast Folk. And I know what you're thinking, because what I'm about to describe, you're immediately going to think, wait a minute, this sounds like a furry. No, it is not a furry. Beast Folk are a weird one. Nobody really knows their exact they don't know where they came from. There are theories. One of the most prominent ones is some ancient human program that tried to take the advantages and boons that some animals have and try to augment and upgrade their soldiers, such as, for example, the fennec fox. They have incredible hearing due to the way that their ears are. So as a result, maybe some human scientists decided, let's take this idea of the fennec fox's hearing and apply it to super soldiers. Long story short, something went wrong, or perhaps even right, and we now have beast folk. Beast folk are incredibly primitive, oftentimes in an era more similar to a hunter-gatherer. They're natural nomads and almost never interact with any other race unless it is beneficial to them in some way. As a result, beast folk, they don't have the same mental capacity that other races have. As a result, they can never really be civilized. They can be domesticated, and in fact, aside from the Ciritans themselves, the beast folk are the second highest population within the Ciritan Empire as a whole. But like I said, they don't have very good mental capabilities, so a lot of times, depending on what species they're based off of, will kind of determine how the Ciritan Empire uses them. Perhaps there is a beast folk that is based off of, let's say, a wolf, or an elephant, or a tiger, or a lion, or something like that. Oftentimes, they'll be put into positions where heavy physical labor is mandatory, thus saving costs when it comes to things like forklifts. And you would think that this would sound like an incredibly horrible situation for beast folk. However, the majority of their races, no matter what subspecies they come from, so long as they're fed and they're given a decent place to sleep, they honestly could care less. Now, there are statistical outliers. Beast folk who have been born with the mental capabilities on par with humans, maybe even sometimes Ciritans, as Ciritans are oftentimes considered just to be a direct upgrade to humanity. One in specific, and one that requires her own deep dive, was a beast folk based off of an Arctic wolf. Her name was Celestine, otherwise known as the White Wall, and at one time she was one of the Ciritan commanders. This means that she held the third highest rank within the Ciritan military. Now, as a general rule of thumb, when it comes to beast folk, they're relatively easy to handle. Like I said, give them food, a decent place to sleep, and they'll do pretty much whatever you tell them. You can kind of think of them as almost like Ogrins from Warhammer 40k. You know, they're not particularly intelligent, they can't really speak the language, but they can get the general gist of what you mean, unless it's something more complicated, in which point it's basically hopeless. You're basically talking to a brick wall. Now, of course, there are certain subspecies of beast folk that aren't really well tailored to the life of heavy physical labor, and as a result, they serve so many different positions within the Ciritan Empire, so long as they're positions that are considered you don't require a lot of intellect to do it. The next one, interestingly enough, the next minor species is dragons. Now that may sound a little weird. Wait. Isn't the Ciritan Empire purely based off of super sci-fi technology? Yes, but you need to remember that magic also exists. So do gods. Shattered Legacies is a mix of hyper sci-fi meets fantasy. And as a result, a lot of fantasy races do exist. There are elves, there are dwarves, there are orcs, but they oftentimes don't have that prevalent of a position within Shattered Legacies. Dragons, on the other hand, do have one. There are 3 primary archetypes when it comes to dragons. These being the horned dragons, the armored dragons, and the spiked dragons. Now, horned dragons are your stereotypical Western dragon. Big-ass quadrupedal beast with wings on its back that can breathe fire. And they're oftentimes used as a form of heavy siege or shock troop by the Ciritan military. This is due to the fact that dragons are relatively tame. It isn't the stereotypical dragon that is incredibly pissed off all the time and will just burn down this village because I saw you, fuck you, you exist, now you don't. They're incredibly docile. That being said, you can certainly find very aggressive dragons, and those are oftentimes a problem. However, Horned dragons, by far, out of the three archetypes, are the most docile and the easiest to tame. And like I said, they're oftentimes used to break sieges or simply as shock troops against various different enemies of the Siritan Empire. Next up, we have the armored dragon. They don't possess wings, but as their name implies, they have armor plates on top of armor plates. And their primary form of offense is literally charge the enemy. That being said, armored dragons aren't exclusively used within the military. A lot of times they are also utilized within various different areas that require heavy physical labor, kind of like the beast folk. This is due to the fact that armored dragons are incredibly strong. While still being quadrupedal, you can essentially use them sort of as pack animals. Oftentimes there is special harnesses that can be put on them, and then you can just load insane amounts of weight on them, and they can handle an incredible amount of weight. Oftentimes they can handle upwards of 7 tons on their backs before they start to struggle. And if you get a particularly powerful one, the record for armored dragons was 14 tons on its back, which is an incredible amount of weight. To put that into perspective, 2,000 pounds is 1 ton. You can do the math. That is a lot of weight. And as a result, they're oftentimes almost used like biological forklifts, you know? They'll strap a whole bunch of equipment onto an armored dragon and say, go over there. And then it goes over there, and then they unload everything. And it's far cheaper than, say, sending a shuttle, or sending a train, or sending a truck, or however the Siritan Empire decides that they need to transport something. Not only that, but dragons are relatively easy to take care of, you know? They're even easier than beast folk. They don't even need a good place to sleep. They don't particularly care where they sleep, and so long as you supply them with enough meat, depending on the species, the spike dragon is specifically herbivore, they're more than happy to do just about anything. That being said, when armored dragons are used in the military, they are designed as bunker busters. They literally are turned in a specific direction, and basically, like, the Siritan Empire doesn't do this exactly, but it's kind of like, you know, you're behind a horse and you hit it with a riding crop and it freaks out and bolts in the opposite direction. That's basically what armored dragons do. They bum rush the fortified location and just crash through the walls, creating massive openings and breaches in the enemy defenses. Not only this, but it doesn't even matter if the things get surrounded. They have so much armor plating on themselves that it oftentimes requires dedicated anti-tank class weaponry in order to take them down. And even if you're using that type of weaponry, there's no guarantee that you're going to take them down. The humans in specific have a very hard time dealing with armored dragons, which is why the Siritan Empire loves to use them against the humans. Humans largely depend on plasma-based weaponry because it's incredibly powerful. Unfortunately, plasma, for whatever reason, is close enough to magic, and dragons, naturally being magical creatures, are incredibly resilient to magic. As a result, they're incredibly resilient to plasma-based weaponry. Compare that to the Siritan Empire, which, after plasma, you would likely have fusion technology. After that is the Siritan Empire's utterly bizarre plasmite, which is a substance that simultaneously, which it completely breaks the laws of physics, but it simultaneously exists within a solid state, a liquid state, a gaseous state, and a plasma state all at once, simultaneously. How it works, nobody really knows. It was an invention created by the Techno Jackson, which immediately means nobody's ever going to figure this out, and it's incredibly powerful. But of course, the Siritan Empire considers this to be somewhat primitive nowadays, now that they use Solstite, which is quite literally the power of a star in your hands, which, fun fact, misuse it, and you can boil the atmosphere of a planet with one shot. And it doesn't even need to be a big one. It could literally be a Solstite pistol. If you're messing around with it, you could boil away the atmosphere. And of course, the Siritan Empire is now experimenting and rolling out antimatter weaponry. Specifically, antimatter, not antimaterial. Antimaterial is anti-tank. Antimatter is the opposite of matter itself. It literally obliterates anything it touches. But long story short, armored dragons are really a problem for just about anyone except maybe the Florians. Beyond this, we have the spiked dragon, which is solely used within the Sirijan military, as there's not really a whole lot of uses for it. It is covered in almost porcupine-like spikes all over its body, and is capable of detaching these from its body, and if it's moving around violently, can even launch these spikes at incredible speed and distance. Furthermore, due to the utterly bizarre genetics of a spiked dragon, they regrow at an incredible rate. Specifically, the spikes located in the tail. Not so much the ones that are located in the body. Those can oftentimes take a few days to weeks to grow back. But due to the insane genetics of whatever a spiked dragon is, the spikes on its tail are capable of regenerating within a few minutes. As a result, the Sirijan Empire uses them as incredibly cheap and organic-based artillery divisions, quite literally setting up spiked dragons at strategic locations and having them quite literally just whip their tail around at a specific direction and just launching these spikes everywhere. These spikes, by the way, are incredibly hard and come in at incredibly high velocities due to the unique way that the spikes themselves are, I don't want to say designed because they weren't bioengineered, but you kind of get what I mean. They are incredibly aerodynamic, similar to bullets, and as a result, they can reach incredibly high velocities and in rare situations can even punch through armor plating if the angle is correct. Next up, we have the elves. The elves are incredibly rare. You can do the math as to why. Maybe not the math, but elves are incredibly rare. They have very low birth rates, and when they do get pregnant, their pregnancy can last multiple years on end. And as a result, their population largely stays incredibly low. However, the Aventans are constantly wanting to get elves on their hands, simply because elves, stereotypically, are incredibly good at magic. Now, are they as good as, say, members of the natural disasters, or, God forbid, the calamity candidates? No. But they're still good at magic, and as a result, oftentimes weaker forms of the Mage's Core can be deployed with elves, as not only are elves incredibly good at casting magic, but they're also very, very resistant to magic, and as a result, they can oftentimes be sent against the Aventans when it is required, as the Aventans largely only use magic, and elves being incredibly resilient to magic means that they can quite literally just walk through enemy spells. That being said, there are a multitude of different types of elves. You obviously have your standard elves known as highborn elves, and one important thing is that elves within Shadow Legacies, they don't have that hoity-toity snobbishness that elves typically have. Like, haha, I am an elf. I am superior to everybody else. You are nothing more than a lowly human or an orc or a dwarf. No, they don't have an attitude like that. They're actually quite pleasant to deal with. Honestly, the best way I can describe it is Eldar when they're interacting with their own. You know, they're not almost arrogant, they're just very pleasant to hang out with, you know? But so, highborn elves are basically just your standard elf. They're very good at magic, they are incredibly agile, and they have a natural affinity for archery, although archery really isn't that useful. They do struggle a bit with modern day weaponry, i.e. guns, but they make decent soldiers. That being said, they're almost never used because, again, low birth rate. One of the rarest types of elves are known as the Fae, or the Snow Elves. Now, before anybody says, yes, I am aware what the Fae actually are. They are Scottish mythology, I believe. They're known as the Fair Folk or the Fairies. They're not the same thing as in Shadow Legacies. The Fae within Shadow Legacies are snow elves, and they're by far the most rare of all types of elves. They're only found on tundra worlds, oftentimes only within tundra forests that span entire continents. And the villages that they exist within have incredibly ancient spells that protect the village. Not only does it create a shield around, or I guess a ward around the entire village, but it also makes it completely imperceptible unless you yourself are a fae or you're being invited in by a fae. And as a result, it's almost impossible to find these guys, but their natural affinity with ice magic, shocker, snow elf, ice, anyway, is insane. They're easily capable of pulling their weight with certain natural disasters, and some of their strongest warriors could probably come close to being Certain Calamity candidates. They're incredibly powerful, but they're by far the rarest and the lowest population out of all elves. Next up, of the prominent elves, we have the Drow, or the Dark Elves, or, as they're properly known, the Demon Tribe. Now, I don't think we really covered the Demon Tribe all that much when we covered the Demon Legion, and this is due to the fact that the Demon Tribe has no affiliation with the Demon Legion. The Demon Tribe themselves, as I just said, are the Drow, or Dark Elves, and nobody's really sure about their history. The Snow Elves are probably the only ones that actually remember what went down, but basically, from what we can gather, with the very limited information the Certain Empire has, there was some ancient war between multiple different species of elves, and the Dark Elves did something that was so incredibly abhorrent that their entire subspecies of elf was stuck in a pocket dimension that was capable of self-perpetuating itself, and basically just locked in there like a prison cell, and they threw away the key. And as a result, the entirety of the Drow are stuck within this pocket dimension. But if you think that this pocket dimension is hospitable, you'd be wrong. It is a hellish, barren wasteland filled with apex predators that almost exclusively hunt the Drow. As a result, their population is by far the lowest out of all elves, even more so than the Snow Elves or the Fae. However, the Drow didn't take this sitting down, and as a result, their magical capabilities exploded. They're by far the strongest out of all elves. Not only magically, but physically as well. They are insanely fast, in a dead sprint, easily going over 100 miles an hour. It's insane when these things fight. It's basically like the Drow are like Warhammer 40k Harlequins. That's what they are. You know? They move at incredible speeds. They have ferociously powerful magic. Some of their weakest warriors would easily be able to be members of the Certain Calamity candidates. That being said, their strongest warriors aren't calamities themselves, but they're certainly close. They could probably make the two weakest calamities, either Faust or Benimaru, they could definitely give them a run for their money. Faust and Benimaru would still probably win, but it would be a close fight. And keep in mind just how powerful those two are. They're proper calamities. They may be the weakest of them, but they're as strong as the highest pantheon of gods. So, yeah. But as a result, they're trapped infinitely within their dimension. But every once in a blue moon, one of them somehow unknowingly and mysteriously manages to find a way to escape their hellish little pocket dimension, and 99% of the time proceed to go on a mass murder rampage until there is literally nothing alive around them, or they're finally brought down just out of pure spite. Because you have to remember where they live. Like, it's completely barren, dark the majority of the time, and it's completely inhospitable. They can't grow crops. They quite literally have to hunt the apex predators that are hunting them in order to survive. And a lot of the times, the hunters that go and try and kill those things, they don't come back. It is a literal hellscape that they're trapped in. And then they finally get out and they look around, and it's like the Garden of fucking Eden everywhere that they look. Even if it's a desert world, it's like, shit, this is more hospitable than this pocket dimension world stuck in. And they just get pure spite in them and just obliterate everything around them. And it is a serious, serious problem. Oftentimes, calamity candidates or Siritan calamities proper are required to be sent in to deal with these drows that escape. And there's no fixed location. Like, okay, they somehow managed to do some weird magical voodoo bullshit and got out of their pocket dimension, but they always land right here. No, they can literally land anywhere in reality. Sometimes they land in areas that the Siritan Empire has no jurisdiction over. Like, there was one time a drow had escaped and it landed deep within Florian quote-unquote territory. There was a Florian nearby, and it was Armageddon. The two could not take each other down. The Florian was practically indestructible, and the drow was too damn fast for the Florian to catch, which was incredible to say the least, considering the Florian can quite literally teleport wherever the hell it wants, as well as teleporting its munitions wherever the hell it wants. And it just couldn't keep up. And it was just this constant war of attrition that did significant and permanent ecological damage to a supercontinent on a world. To the point where it became completely inhospitable by the time the Florian finally managed to take down the drow. And most surprisingly of all, this Florian had suffered significant damage. When we covered the Florians, I said how hard it is to take down a Florian. Now, luckily, it wasn't a Forge Master. It was a Warlord Florian. But still, it took significant damage and had to leave the battlefield for a very long time while it repaired itself. It was a wicked battle. Now, obviously, the Siritan Empire has no actual records of this ever occurring. As, like I said, it was deep within Florian, quote-unquote, territory. Like I said, the Florians don't actually hold territory, but they have a region of reality that they oftentimes hang around in, and that's oftentimes considered just to be Florian territory, as the Florians will oftentimes attack anything that comes too close, simply because this is kind of just where they hang out, you know? It's not their actual territory, because they don't claim territory, but this is kind of just like where they go to vibe, you know? That sort of situation. So, let's see. What's another minor faction? Or I guess not minor faction, but another minor race. I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. Those are the only ones that I had prepared in advance. There are a multitude of different minor races that I've probably created and then subsequently forgot because they were so minor that it was like I said before, if I were to ever make this an episode, it's like a minor race that was in a single episode just for that episode and then never featured again, you know? I guess we can go over dwarves. I mean, there's not much to go over. They're dwarves, you know? Look up any fantasy. There you go. They're dwarves. There is technically a subspecies of dwarf known as astral dwarves. And this is old lore, technically retconned lore, but I still think it's relatively interesting, and I might bring it back in some way or fashion. So, the old lore was, and this specific part still stands, is that the original divine weapons were created by Tesha. However, obviously Tesha was locked away, but the gods still required the power of divine weapons, and as a result they had to find a way to not only make them weaker and not, shall we say, morally dubious, but they had to, actually produce these things. And they came across a subspecies of dwarf known as the astral dwarves, which was capable of working with the metal of the gods. For lack of a better name and any creativity whatsoever, we're simply going to call the metal of the gods Divinium. And divinium is basically, it can only really be worked by gods and apparently astral dwarves. Now, this is the part that is actually retconned. Subsequent divine weapons, basically the third and fourth generation, the second weakest and the weakest, usually, were created by astral dwarves, utilizing divinium that was supplied to them by gods, and they would constantly make them. It's kind of similar to, which of the Thor movies was it? I don't think it was Ragnarok, but it might be the one where Thor gets the axe. You know, he has to go to the weird, like, super fucking massive dwarves, and there's like one left, and he has no hands, and he has to like stand in the middle of a sun ray or whatever the fuck it is. It's kind of similar to that, you know. They utilize various different, literal archaic means to create divine weapons that are incredibly weak. You know, like I said, these are third and fourth generation divine weapons. They're nothing stellar, you know. They're definitely powerful, but the majority, 90% of the time, when we're talking about third and fourth generation divine weapons, they're never going to be used. They're never going to be used because they're almost exclusively for mortals. And the chances of a mortal actually unlocking the divine weapon is like winning the lottery. You know? It's so incredibly rare for a mortal to gain access to their divine weapon. You would have a better shot at winning the Powerball. You know? That being said, it is possible. But again, and this is retconned as well, it was the astral dwarves that set up the system by which divine weapons are unlocked. And they didn't set down the specific parameters, you know. This specific divine weapon can be unlocked with this specific thing, you know. It was more so, I'm going to give this divine weapon a completely unknowable unlock criteria. Even I don't know it. Boom. Whimsical, magical bullshit. There you go. It now has some unlock criteria, and I did it. You're welcome. Fuck you. You know? And so, it's like I said, you know, for, like, the legendary Jackson, his unlock criteria was that he had to become a god. Normal mortals are not capable of becoming gods. You have to be in good graces with a god, and then that god has to consider you worthy to become a god in order to, well, become a god. A mortal can't just become a god, but of course, Legend did it, but we also know that Legend himself is an anomaly. He isn't normal. He isn't standard for what reality considers to be normal. He is an anomaly, and as a result, he was capable of becoming a god without the graces of a god. Now, in old retconned lore, there was actually the soul of a god that existed in him at, like I said, if we made this into an anime, it would literally be season 1, episode 1, you know, that early. But, and again, this lore is retconned, but that god never granted Legend the honor of eventually becoming a god. He never gave him that access. Legend became a god through literally blood, sweat, and tears. You know, just his own power and his own capabilities. And also, retconned, he killed multiple gods, and this was before the concept of incomplete immortality existed, where you have to be an equal or greater entity to whatever you are fighting in order to be able to kill said entity. So if you're a lesser god, you have to be a lesser god or higher in order to kill them. If you're a demigod or a mortal, you can damage the lesser god, but you cannot kill them directly or indirectly. That's relatively new in comparison to the original retconned lore. So as a result, Legend killed many gods in the retconned lore, when nowadays he shouldn't be able to, but whatever. I still have to iron out his new background lore, simply because, again, we retconned the old lore, because it was back when I was first making Shadow Legacies, and I had no idea where the hell I wanted to take this idea, and so I kind of just started making shit up, and later on I'm like, yeah, I don't like the way that was planned out, you know? I don't like the way that old lore was. But, so yeah, dwarves are Dwarves, they're the astral dwarves. They still exist as a subspecies, but their lore of creating divine weapons has been retconned. They're basically just dwarves deluxe edition. You know, they're better at being a dwarf, basically. And dwarves, what do dwarves do? They mine and they forge, you know? And so astral dwarves are just better at doing both. That being said, dwarves are still useful, and they're actually used a lot within the Siritan Empire. Oftentimes as, again, miners. You can basically think of like Deep Rock Galactic, you know? They have billions upon trillions upon quadrillions upon an infinite number of planets that are slated solely for mining. And it's basically like Deep Rock Galactic and Hoxie's. They send some dwarves down, they do whatever the fuck dwarves do in a potentially hostile, barren hellscape of a planet, get minerals, and then get the fuck out. The shooting of bugs may or may not be a thing. I will say this, Deep Rock Galactic does not exist within Shattered Legacies. But it's just dwarves, you know? And eventually some of these races may get a bit of a tune-up, such as a good example for this, maybe not necessarily for my dwarves, but you know how in Warhammer 40k they're coming out with the lore of the Leagues of Votan, which are basically what the fuck were they called in old 40k lore? What was it? The squats, which was literally just dwarves with big ass guns on motorcycles. It was just the goofiest fucking thing ever back when 40k did not take itself seriously. And it was phenomenal. And then they retconned the shit out of the squats and they brought them back as the Leagues of Votan, which are fucking cool as shit. But regardless, you know, there may be a Leagues of Votan type of situation, or a squats Leagues of Votan situation where, you know, dwarves, elves, some of these lesser minor races that don't have nearly as much lore will get kind of a tune-up and become actual proper factions rather than anything. But, so, yeah, I think that's probably where we're going to leave the episode. I don't think we quite hit an hour. I obviously can't check OBS because I am just recording my screen right now, my monitor. And I'd rather not pop over into OBS right now. But, yeah, that's about all I had really thought of for this episode. In the next episode, we're probably going to cover the Yvetans. I think it's time for their debut. Either that or the Bastillions. Bastillions or Yevens. I'm not sure which one, but they definitely deserve their debut. We need to finish out the major factions. But so yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow and Friday's modded survival, as well as Saturday and Sunday's live streams at noon Central Standard Time, where on Saturday we're going to be covering some RimWorld, as aggravating as that can be sometimes, as well as on Sunday, which will be Sunday Night Live, where I pick a random game and we just game it out for 2 hours, following by next Monday, where we have our 7 Days to Die episode, and next Tuesday, where we have, once again, Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. So, until then, guys, see ya.